Well, a very good evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you are in the world, to this BA community webinar. This evening we've got a panel session and we're going to be discussing the tricky topic of business analysis and well-being. I always think that it's good to discuss these type of topics at the beginning of the year. There's something like a sort of mental refresh that happens in the new year, and you may have New Year's resolutions, perhaps around work-life balance. And if you do, or even if you don't, then I'm hoping that the session today will help us all think a little bit more critically about how we view work-life balance, well-being, and those sorts of broader topics as well. I'm really pleased to say we are joined by Christina Lovelock and Corrine Thomas this evening. So before we kick off, just a brief introduction to both of our speakers this evening. Christina Lovelock leads the business analysis practice at the University of Leeds. She's very, very active in the BA community, regularly speaking and attending local and national events. She's a BCS oral examiner for the International Diploma in Business Analysis. So if you have the diploma, you may have been examined by her. And she's also a director of the National BA Manager Forum. She's very, very committed to the development of future generations of business analysts and business analysis, and she played a driving role through the BA Manager Forum of the creation of the national standard for the apprenticeship in business analysis. She's also spoken at many conferences, including back in 2016 at the BA Conference Europe with a presentation entitled The BA Happiness Project. Over to Corrine, and Corrine Thomas is an experienced leader and business analyst with over 25 years working across a range of industry sectors, including local government, healthcare, telecommunication, financial services. In fact, I first met Corrine when I was being interviewed by her for a job, and I was thinking about this earlier, Corrine. Do you realise that was over a decade ago? How time flies. Corrine has a proven track record of creating and transforming the capability of BA practices. She's also a director of the BA Manager Forum and an oral examiner for the BCS International BA Diploma, and is really passionate about helping people make choices in their careers and to balance work and well-being. So a very, very warm welcome to both Christina and Corrine.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So our agenda for this evening, and to remind everyone who is listening in, this is interactive. Many of you have submitted questions in advance, and we will cover as many of those as we possibly can. But please do remember the chat window is open, or the Q&A window is open, I should say. So please do type in as many questions as you like. We'll cover as many of them as you can. So our agenda for this evening. Well, we're going to start off with just some brief conversation starters. I'm going to invite Corrine and then Tina to give a brief overview of their perspectives on well-being. Then we're going to go straight over to the panel discussion, and then finally I'm just going to invite any conclusions and final thoughts from both of our speakers. And as a reminder, you can type questions in at any point. So let's get straight on and start with some conversation starters. And firstly, Corrine. So Corrine, over to you.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm not too sure about the reminder of it's a decade since we met, and I've been in the industry for 25 years. But that's fine. And good evening to everybody. Welcome, and thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. And so I thought I'd start just by reflecting a bit on life these days. And it's getting increasingly busy. It certainly is for me, and I sense for people I meet and people around us that we do live in an increasingly busy and stressful world. We've got a sort of always-on culture where we're expected to be available 24/7, and I think social media and technology, whilst it was created to help us, can sometimes hinder us by that everything's always there. We're exposed to lots of news from many channels. Often the news is bad because bad news makes good stories. And we don't stop to take breaks. We're always busy, rushing from one thing to another. And for those of us that are working on business change, which the majority of us are as business analysts, there's pressure to deliver in increasingly complex change. IT is complex, businesses are complex, businesses are changing. They're difficult worlds to live in, and we do have challenging stakeholders to deal with. I mean, those challenging stakeholders themselves have busy lives, and that sometimes can drive some of that behaviour. And our brains have a natural negative bias, hence why the news always has a negative bias, because that's what perks up our attention. And as business analysts, our role is to solve problems, to solve things that aren't good. And we're looking for outcomes, but we start in the problem space. And all of that can lead us to feeling stress and the stress response beginning in our bodies. So if we move on to the next slide, Adrian. I thought I'd just talk a little bit about our minds and our brains and how we're wired and how we need to think about balancing our mindset. Because our brains are very good at recognizing danger. That's why we have a negativity bias. And deep inside our brain, in an area called the limbic system, which is part of our primitive brain, it's the part of the brain that evolved first, we've got a little almond-shaped organ called the amygdala. Now, the amygdala's role is to act as a sentry and a lookout. And if it perceives threat, it will very quickly, within milliseconds, start creating stress hormones through the body and getting us to run away. But the response of that is that we can get what's called an amygdala hijack. So I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like that. It can result in what's known as possibly as an emotional outburst. Sometimes if somebody gets very angry or somebody gets very upset, it's as a result of amygdala hijack. And in those situations, I don't know about you, but I just can't think of anything. And that's because the more executive function of our brain, the frontal cortex, which developed later in our history, has been closed down. The amygdala is going, look, you've got to run away, there's danger around. And when we first were created, it was about running away from saber-toothed tigers and mammoths. In our modern world, I don't think we have any of those around, but the amygdala still works in the way it used to, and it can trigger this fight or flight response from perceived threats, such as relationship trouble, difficulties, money troubles, worries about projects, worries about work, maybe giving a presentation, a phobia. But the amygdala still works in the way it's always worked. And then to balance that out, we also have an area of our brain called the ventral striatum, not quite as easily tripping off the tongue as the amygdala. Again, it's in the limbic system, but the ventral striatum's role is all to do with reward. That's the area of the brain that will release dopamine. And that's the bit where we'll feel calmer, we're able to enjoy ourselves, and everything becomes clearer again. So really life is a matter of trying to balance the amygdala and the ventral striatum. So we're balancing our stress hormones, such as adrenaline and cortisol, with the dopamine. And unfortunately for us, cortisol and adrenaline hang around in the body longer than dopamine. But we can manage this through some of the activities that we do. So I'm going to move on now just to introduce well-being and what is well-being. And it's a very difficult subject to define. So if I was trying to put the term well-being through a requirements gateway, I don't think it would pass any of them. It's very difficult to define it in a concise and clear way. And it can mean different things to different people. So I thought what I'd start with is just going right back to 1948 and looking at what the World Health Organization defined as health in those days. And they said that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. So the absence of illness is about having well-being in physical, mental, and social capacity. And then later on, it was defined, well-being was defined as a state of successful performance throughout life. And again, there was reference to an integration of physical, cognitive, and emotional health. Now, psychology has traditionally always focused on the negative parts of life, things that have gone wrong. But there is a movement called positive psychology, which started around 30 years ago or more by Martin Seligman, and he started to bring people together to look at the positive sides of life and well-being. And again, there's two kind of schools of thought here and two ways of defining well-being. So there's one that's what's called subjective well-being, which is what's on the slide now. And it's all about really our positive feelings, the pleasure we get in life, how satisfied we are, how happy we are, and how much of our life is filled with positive emotion and feeling rather than negative emotion. And I'm sure as business analysts, you're probably all looking at that and thinking, well, actually, they're very difficult things to measure. If you had to define a requirement for satisfied with life, it would be very difficult to create clear acceptance criteria because it's very subjective for each of us. And a number of psychologists, such as Ed Diener, have tried to create a satisfaction with life measure. And there is a scale out there that you can have a look at if you want to. So this one's all about positive feelings and is often referred to as hedonia, the hedonic feelings that you get now. It's all about pleasure and positive feelings. So another way of looking at well-being, if we could move on, is about psychological well-being. And this is more about personal fulfillment, positive functioning, the sort of longer term things we do to stay well. And again, a number of the psychologists have worked on this psychological well-being, including Martin Seligman. But this definition I've got here comes from a lady called Carol Riff, who worked on this in the 1980s. And she's defined six areas that come together to define that psychological well-being or personal fulfillment. So it's all about self-acceptance. And self-acceptance is about having a positive evaluation of ourselves and our lives and a positive attitude towards ourselves. And then it's also important in another area, she talks about having positive relations with others. So it's being able to connect and have trusting relationships with others and being able to show empathy. So again, these are key things in our roles as business analysts and our lives as a whole. And again, psychological well-being is a purpose in life as part of that. So having goals, having a sense of direction helps towards psychological well-being. And then autonomy, feeling of independence, being able to regulate our own behavior, feeling at choice in what we do. And personal growth is important, having that sense of continual growth, continual development as individuals. And then the final one she talked about was environmental mastery. So this is all about having a sense of feeling that we're competent and we can master the environment around us, having a sense that we can use our surroundings and make opportunities for ourselves, and we're in control of our context and it works for us. So those are the sort of things that come together to make up well-being. And for any of you that have kind of studied in this area, you may have heard of Maslow and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So this comes from way back, but a lot of the well-being work in current times does still link back to Maslow, who kind of said that we need to have our basic needs met around food, shelter, and safety. And as we work through Maslow's hierarchy, we start to look at relationships with others, how we feel about ourselves, and finally our self-actualization is about fulfilling our potential. So all of these elements hopefully start to give you a flavor of what well-being is. And I'm now going to pass over to Tina, who's going to talk a little bit more about well-being and what it might mean to us as business analysts.
Well, thank you for that, Corrine. And as Adrian mentioned earlier, a couple of years ago, I did quite a bit of research into happiness for the BA Happiness Project. And it doesn't take long when you're researching happiness to find yourself researching unhappiness. And one of the things that I looked into quite a bit was stress. So if we could go forward, Adrian. There's two key takeaways from the research that I did. And one of the things that I found was that stress doesn't actually affect all cognitive processes and skills equally. And the ones that it affects most are unfortunately the ones that we need the most. So the impact of stress on BAs is actually more prevalent for us than it is for other people doing roles that don't rely quite so heavily on these types of cognitive processes. It's actually going to affect us more. But the second thing that I took away from the research that I'd done is that we as BAs have tools and techniques available to us that we typically employ to deliver on our projects and for our organisations that we can actually use to help ourselves. So techniques such as the most analysis, root cause analysis, Fishbone diagram, options analysis and force field analysis to help us make personal decisions, understand the causes of our stress or unhappiness in our lives, and to figure out options and ways forward for us. So there are two things that BAs universally like and that we have in common. And the first is the phrase, "I don't want to reinvent the wheel." And the second is that we all love a good framework. So because I don't want any of you to have to reinvent the wheel, I want to share a framework which is called the 5 Ways to Wellbeing, which is a result of several studies that were commissioned and published by the Department of Health. And the 5 areas are to keep learning, to be active, to connect, to give, and to take notice. And these things apply as much during the hours that we're at work as they do outside of work. And not everyone likes the term well-being. It sounds a little bit fluffy or new age, but when we see these 5 elements laid out next to each other, I think that we're actually answering a much more fundamental question here, and that's, how do we want to live our lives? So because these elements have been scientifically researched and are proven to improve our well-being, they're a great place to start for using one of our own BA techniques. I can ask you to move forward again, Adrian. Here's the kind of outline of a fishbone or root cause analysis, which is a really useful way of organising your thoughts and coming up with things which you're either going to start doing or stop doing to improve your well-being. And I've given some examples here, if we could just move on again, of things that I do or have done at work within each of these 5 areas. Just want to pick out a couple of them. The first is running a BA book club at work, where different people read different chapters of a book, and we can come back together, that person summarise it, and we all discuss it. And so really, it probably straddles both keeping learning and connecting, actually. That was a really good joint learning activity that I've done in a couple of organisations now. And another one is that I do most of my one-to-one meetings with my team as walking meetings. It's great to get out of the office, to get some steps in while we're at work, and see and enjoy the changes of the season. And I'm also a real advocate for the use of the MOST analysis as a personal development tool, and including wellbeing, because I think these things that we use on a daily basis to solve work-based problems and project problems are equally valuable for some of the problems that we face, and particularly around this area of wellbeing. So I'm going to stop there, Adrian, because I know you've got a lot of questions that you want us to look at.
Yes, indeed, and I can see that you've put the URL for the 5 Ways to Wellbeing on the screen there, Tina. So yeah. Is that a report you'd recommend reading?
Absolutely, it's really short and just gives you some really good ideas of how you can improve your own wellbeing.
Fantastic. And just in case anyone hasn't got a pen handy, just a reminder, there will be a recording of the webinar available, so you'll be able to look at the slides after or the recording after as well. So okay, that moves us on, and thank you very much, Corrine and Tina, for a really, really useful introduction, some really thought-provoking ideas there already. But I'm keen for us to move over to the Q&A. And as a reminder to those people listening live, you can type in questions at any point, but we do have a whole number of pre-submitted questions. And so I'm going to start with a pre-submitted question. And the question, I'll put this one to Corrine to start with, see what you make of this, Corrine. But the question is, can you suggest some good ways of prioritizing time when you have work deadlines and study deadlines? So it sounds like someone is struggling with a sort of work-life balance situation.
Yeah, that's a difficult and really good question, and I think it's one many of us face a lot of the times. It's a work deadline, a study deadline. But for me, I think it is about, and there's always going to be pressure on time, and I think some of it's about, I suppose, planning ahead initially, working out the big chunks and the big milestones you need to achieve, but then also break it down into smaller chunks. I think particularly if you're trying to fit study in around busy workload, so it's looking for snippets in the day maybe when you can take some time out to do your study. And I've got a colleague who is very busy at work, has a very demanding job, but is also studying for a degree. And what she said to me is actually, she first of all, she always makes sure she takes her lunch break. And that's something I would advise everybody, whether you're trying to manage your time between study and work. But I think lunch breaks are very important, and take them away from your desk. So she says for her lunch break, she does actually go outside for a while to give herself some time for herself to clear her head. But then she gives herself half an hour to actually do some of her study, whether it's reading a book or writing something. So I think it is about, booking a meeting with yourself and kind of keeping it sacrosanct, so that she uses lunchtime. But for other people, it might be if you have a study day allocated, if you're fortunate enough to have that, or if you've got flexible working and you've chosen to book out a block of time. I think it's about booking it with yourself, making sure that's as important in your mind as your work deadlines, and to prevent people wandering by desks and having conversations, which I remember happening a lot. It's find somewhere to go. Book yourself a meeting room if you're in an office, go outside somewhere else, well, basically where you can't be interrupted. Remove the distractions of technology as much as possible. And I hope that will help. So that's my first thoughts.
Those are really useful thoughts, Corrine, and I think what you were saying there about taking lunch is a really important point, because I suspect we've all, and probably many people listening, have worked in cultures where there's a bit of a sandwiches over the keyboard type culture, and actually that's probably counterproductive, because I'm guessing if we're tired, we probably just perform less well in the afternoon.
Yeah, I think just even 15 minutes away, allowing the mind to quieten will re-energize you, whether it's for work or whether it's for study.
Fantastic.
And I just wanted to add one more thing before you move on, is that actually doing small things every day. Don't forget, I suppose, at the end of a week to just almost take stock of where you've come and what you have achieved, because that helps you stay motivated.
Absolutely. So celebrate those successes. So.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. And Tina, anything to add?
What was kind of specifically on that question around competing deadlines, kind of personal and work or study and work? I think the thing for me is kind of to notice things about yourself. So the voices in your head that say things like, well, I'm not going to worry about that yet, or I can't think about that until after X. Think about those little dialogues that you have with yourself, because those are kind of the bargains that we make with ourselves, and why I don't have to do this right now, or why it's okay to put something off. Realizing what kind of person you are, and then kind of beating yourself at your own game, I suppose, making it as easy as possible for you to not listen to some of those things that encourage bad habits.
So you're sort of listening to your inner monologue and trying to challenge it, I guess, to a certain extent. Yeah. No, really, really interesting. And the only thing I'd add to, I think that those are two really, really useful perspectives. The only slight vignette I might add, I'm funny enough, I'm studying at the moment as well, and for me personally, I find the best time for me to study is early morning. So I'm the sort of person that will get up very early and do sometimes 2 hours study before the phone starts ringing. So as Corrine sort of alluded to, I guess it's about finding a particular time and routine that works. So okay, fantastic. So moving on, and I'll put this next question to Tina first. So as a practice lead, what good habits should you try and encourage in your BA team?
So one of the first things I would encourage is to actually talk about well-being, and having kind of normalizing the language, I suppose, and making it okay to talk about some of these topics at work, creating that environment where people aren't missing lunch breaks and having sandwiches at their desk all the time, noticing things about people, noticing changes in people's behavior, little things like when people come back to their desk and put their bag or their laptop down with a bit of a sigh, and just kind of asking people how they are, and going past that very British, I'm okay, yes, good, I'm fine, thank you very much, and trying to make it okay to talk about well-being, and that it's okay to not have a good day sometimes.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it, Tina? Because like often there's sort of a perception that it's like, well, how are you? And it's like, yeah, okay, or not too bad. It's sort of this. It just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? It's
Absolutely. So one of the things that I do with my team is we have a monthly pulse survey. A couple of the questions on it is kind of one about your overall well-being, how are you feeling, and the other one is around kind of stress levels, feeling not having any stress, having a little stress but it's manageable, or feeling too stressed. And that's kind of taking the temperature of the team as a whole. It's not attributed to individuals, but just kind of seeing where we are, how the practice is feeling. And then that helps me to make decisions around recruitment and resourcing and the other things that I need to do based on how I know the team's feeling collectively.
Fantastic. And what a great, a great sort of, like you say, pulse health check to be doing. So it's interesting. I remember hearing at a conference, and I can't for the life of me remember the name of who said this, but the phrase stuck with me, was in some organizations it's almost like people wear stress as a badge of honor. And it does feel like that sometimes, doesn't it? They're like, well, if you're not stressed and if you're not busy, then you're not important. But that's I guess a culture that we all need to challenge, because we can be happy and productive, and probably produce more valuable things.
I've seen people use busy as a defense mechanism as well, because if I'm kind of too busy, nobody's going to ask me to do anything else, and if I create this kind of busyness aura around me, then I'll just kind of be left alone.
Yeah, like a busyness bubble, an impenetrable busyness bubble. So fantastic. So Corrine, anything to add?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think what Tina said is really, really important, and I think you've already said it, Tina. But I think in one-to-ones, as a practice lead, when you have one-to-ones, make it an important part to actually check in on how people are feeling. And you've got your pulse surveys, but it's making that conversation an important conversation, as important as how's the project going, what's the task. And I think another one is, yes, we all have difficult days, but sometimes if we can keep a sense of humor, kind of step back for it and have a sense of humor. And something I learned when I was training as a coach, and something I take with me, and I think it's talked about quite a lot in some of the Agile and Lean areas, is there is no failure, there's only feedback. So if you're having a bad day and you feel like everything's going wrong, maybe the feedback you're taking is actually perhaps things are getting too busy. And if things don't go so well, it's just feedback that we can learn from.
Absolutely. And again, a question that somebody suggested in those situations, which I've always found useful as well, is how important will this be to me in 10 years' time?
Yes.
Because so much of what we stress about, actually, forget 10 years, in 10 days it's not going to be important. And those sorts of, that ability to step back is so important as well, isn't it? Fantastic. So we have a couple of questions, a couple of similar questions actually, so I'll kind of bundle them together, but they're around reflection. So firstly, Tina, you mentioned reflection. Are there any particular tools you would recommend for reflective practice?
That's interesting.
It's a very good question.
In terms of tools, I mean, I do like to make notes. I'm not sure I'd necessarily categorize that as a tool, but I think there is something about writing things down and being able to refer back to things, which is really valuable, but also kind of gives you that personal feeling of progression and time passing and things changing, when sometimes it feels that change is very slow to arrive. If you have a record that you can look back at, and I mentioned kind of weekly reflection, weekly summaries, you can actually in quite a short time see how far your thinking has come or how far a situation has changed. So I would definitely say some kind of making notes or having something that you can reflect on. But in terms of actual tools, I'm struggling. Is there anything that you think of, Corrine?
Yeah, I can't remember all the details of it, but there are tools out there around reflective inquiry, reflective analysis. And again, it's about sitting down and either writing, or maybe you could talk and record yourself, but it's thinking about a topic, what went well about this, what did I enjoy about it, what did I learn from it, and then about what would I do differently next time if I did this again. I think that's all the tools that are in it. But if someone's looking for a tool, sometimes it's worth looking across into some of the coaching areas.
Yeah, that was just in my mind as you were saying that, Corrine. And funnily enough, Tina, when you were describing writing things down, I was almost imagining like a journal. Just sort of journaling could be a tool. So journaling and the coaching topics and an idea or concept. I'm not sure whether either of you would be familiar with, but if either of you come across like double loop learning, I think it was Donald Schoen originally.
Yes.
Yeah, so sort of the idea of reflective and reflexive learning. So the sort of what would I do differently, but also what values and inherent beliefs does that make me challenge? But that could be a whole separate webinar.
Yeah, I think a lot of this reflective practice is about kind of almost looking at one level. What did I do? How did it go, etc. But then the stepping back and coming back again is the more reflective of what I would do differently next time. And every time you come round that loop, you get a deeper level of learning.
I think sometimes as well, reflection is about giving yourself the permission to move on from something. I think if something was fun, we find it very troubling or very upsetting or can't quite understand why it played out how it did, it can kind of go round and round in our minds. And I think part of that reflection is actually letting go of things and saying, well, I'm just not going to get to the bottom of that. I'm not going to understand where that person was coming from, but actually I'm going to let it go.
Yeah. We're so diametrically opposed in our worldviews that we're never going to reach consensus, and maybe an accommodation that we can both live with is good enough. But okay, so we've got a couple of questions actually on improving relations with project members. So I'll kind of bundle them up and paraphrase them, but they're very much around if there are difficult situations with project members, a mix of resources, permanent contracts, and strong and opinionated characters, and how can we work more positively and collaboratively together so there's sort of well-being within a group situation as well as an individual situation? Because so far we've quite rightly talked about sort of individual well-being, but what about that situation where there's a mixture of a group with different worldviews and perspectives and thinking about the group well-being? Corrine, any thoughts on that one?
An interesting one, that. Very good question. I think it depends. I think as a group to come together, I think some of it's about listening to each other, but I think it is about allowing every person to talk and say what's important to them. And another thing I use a lot is something that's known as looking at things from different perspectives. And I think this works really well if you're finding it difficult to collaborate or get on with somebody. It's just almost kind of putting yourself in their shoes for a while. So I know that obviously business analysts and project managers can sometimes have a difficult relationship. Other times it's brilliant. But sometimes it's like, if I put myself in the shoes of a project manager, they have to make sure everything's delivered. Sometimes they do push us faster than we want because they have good reasons for doing it. But just reflecting what it's like for them, seeing what it might be like, sometimes gives you thoughts and ideas to talk about. And I think the key thing is it's about bringing things into the room early. If there's a sense of things aren't going well, not getting on as well as we could, just talk about it. I mean, Tina mentioned talking earlier on, and it's so important to just talk about it. And I think for me, it's at that project kickoff time, having that ground rule that talking is good. And everybody, every single person has the resources they need. They're not always aware of it. And through talking to each other, you can bring those resources to the surface and resolve conflict.
Fantastic. Thanks, Corrine. Tina, anything to add?
I think a couple of approaches I'd probably advocate for this would be something like a team charter or a team canvas. So doing an exercise as a team to say how we want to work together, how we want to interact with each other, things that we value as a team, things that we're not going to tolerate as a team. And specifically, in terms of what you were saying, Corrine, I think it's really easy to think I've got a problem with that person and I'm going to talk to my manager about it, or I'm going to talk to their manager about it. But it usually plays out so much better if you speak to the person and say, we don't know each other very well, or we don't seem to have a particularly strong working relationship yet. I'd really like to build that working relationship with you. Should we go for a coffee? And that just opens so many more doors and builds bridges more than kind of chuntering away in the background or escalating issues.
So it's always amazing what the cost of a latte can buy, isn't it?
And it can sometimes be something that's so simple, and that we just have a different way of learning, or a different way of taking in information. And it might be that, oh, this person doesn't understand me, I'm going to go and talk to their manager. But you sit down with them and you kind of go, oh, okay. And so I might be very visual, somebody else might work with lots of detail and facts and figures. And if you can kind of meet each other's styles, it unlocks so many things at an earlier stage. It's
so tempting to hide behind roles and labels and types of boundaries that exist between us. But I think trying to put all of that out of your mind and think, they're a person and I'm a person, let's try and sort it out.
Definitely. Fantastic. So again, some really interesting, thoughtful points there. So moving on to the next question, we'll go to Tina. We'll go to you on this one first. And the question is, what is the best way to approach a conversation with leaders on boundaries before the project begins to achieve the needed balance?
So boundaries, in the context of this question, it sounds a little bit about trying to protect yourself, which I think we all have to do at work. And I think we have to really understand that the person who is going to be most interested in your well-being and protecting your boundaries is you. And you need to understand what that looks like for you, what you're prepared to do, whether that's hours that you're prepared to work, the ways in which you're prepared to work. And be really clear about that for yourself so that you can be clear about it when you speak to other people. And the point that I was making before about having a team charter, for example, about ways of working for the whole team, what's going to be okay and what's not going to be okay. You can't just kind of decide this is how I'm going to be at work and kind of everybody else is just going to have to fit in around me. It does have to be that collaboration, shared ways of working and a shared approach to work. So I think, in summary, you do have to protect yourself. You have to decide how you're going to be at work, but that does have to be in the context of how the wider team wants to work together.
Fantastic. So boundaries, personal boundaries within the context of almost organizational or team boundaries as well, that collaboration. So Corrine, anything to add?
Not a huge amount to add to that. Actually, I'd written down some very similar things to Tina. I think Tina mentioned clear, and I've got on here being clear about the boundaries, being clear about what outcome you're looking for. I suppose the other thing is, when those boundaries are set, there'll always be exceptions, and it's knowing where you can be a bit flexible and what's an absolute not negotiable boundary. So I'm thinking back to the days when I had young children. So for me, my working hours were very fixed. I had to leave work at a set time because that's the time I had to collect my daughter from nursery. So that was a non-negotiable boundary, a non-negotiable time boundary.
There were times when you did that, left work, and then logged back on later in the evening.
Yeah, that was the other thing I was going to say. Sometimes the flexibility would be, actually, I do need to leave now because I have a personal commitment, but I will spend half an hour this evening answering a question. And it's knowing your, it is back to boundaries. It's knowing where you will flex, and also checking in with yourself, making sure you've not violated your own flexible boundaries too many times, if that makes sense. With the flexible ones that are more difficult. I think the non-negotiable are usually easier to stick with. Yeah, people will push, but it's actually, I have to do that because of, and it's that whole discretionary effort that sometimes you have in your mind what's acceptable discretionary effort, and there's where the boundaries get blurred if you continually giving out and not checking back in with yourself. And am I okay with this?
It's well, the word that was springing to my mind when you were saying that, Corrine, and it'd be interesting to see if I'm interpreting this correctly, but it sounds like they're principle based or value based. So actually they're flexible, but you, as you say, check in. I guess you have to check in against your own values occasionally to make sure, well, actually, is everything still balanced? Would you say that that's fair? Is that a fair?
No, I think that is fair.
Yeah.
In values, again, values is another whole topic. We could spend an
Yeah.
hour.
Yeah.
But our values are almost our internal guiding lights. We can be unaware of them until something is in conflict with them. You get that. It's quite difficult to describe it. You sometimes get that niggling gut feeling that something's not right.
Yes.
It will often be a values conflict.
Yes.
And I think it's if you ignore that, let it go on for too long, that's when we start getting into challenges with well-being and how we feel about work, our levels of motivation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, well, the questions are coming in thick and fast, so we'll cover as many of them as we can. So the next question, I'll put this one to you first, Corrine. It's a little bit of a controversial one, so if you don't want to answer it, that's completely fine, of course. But have your own experiences of stressful environments inspired you to talk today? Brilliant question.
Brilliant question. I suppose I could do the easy, just cop out one and go, yes, not say anymore. But yeah, I think stress is an interesting subject in itself. And to a certain extent, at a certain level, we thrive on stress. And a certain level of stress makes us alert, makes us work. But if it's an ongoing stress, that's when it starts to impact us. So as you said, Adrian, at the start, I've got many years of experience in business analysis and change projects. So yes, I've had some difficult challenges. I suppose one of the most challenging ones for me, which I think links back to boundaries actually, was when one of my children was very poorly as a teenager and was very unwell. And I was in a very good position that I had a very supportive manager. And I was able to take time out when I needed to take time out. But inside, the little voice inside me is going, oh, you should be at work, you should be doing more. And that made it more stressful. And then I started to learn some of the tools and techniques around how to look after myself so that I could be there for my child, but also manage my work commitments. And I think, in the project environment, we do sometimes face difficult situations, difficult stakeholders. I've had a couple of what I would call amygdala hijacks happen in front of me. At the time, it's quite scary. And you kind of just learn to let somebody, let the emotion out. And the amygdala hijack is about the emotion coming out, and it comes out in different ways for different people. And again, it's that understanding where they're coming from, let things calm down. And I'm not saying I'm perfect and I always respond in the best way. Sometimes an amygdala hijack will result in one coming back from me. I think it's about learning from these things. And yeah, that's why I'm passionate about well-being and the kind of things we're talking about.
Fantastic. So it sounds very scary being in front of an amygdala hijack. So
yes. 2-year-olds are very good at it. The toddler tantrums in a supermarket is a very young version of an amygdala hijack, as they're trying out, as they're learning.
But probably more expected than in a conference room in a work environment. So.
Yes, it's a little bit different when you're faced with an angry stakeholder.
Absolutely fantastic. Thanks, Corrine. Tina, anything to add?
Well, I think what kind of comes to mind when you start thinking about a stressful environment is really that there's too much to do and not enough time to do it. But those things aren't the only causes of stress, I don't think. I think what's actually going on in a stressful environment is a lack of clarity and poor relationships. Because I've worked in busy teams where we had clear goals and good relationships, and it wasn't a stressful environment. It was actually an energizing and motivating environment. So it's not always about having too much to do and not enough time. It's some of these other factors as well, which I think contribute to a stressful environment.
Absolutely. Okay, so next question, I'll put this one to Tina first. This is, again, another really, really good question. Be really interested to hear your response to this. because this is something I think I suffer from as well, which is any tips on how to quiet your mind? And the questioner says, I'm always in the learning and curiosity mode. I've tried to learn how to meditate, but I haven't gotten the hang of it. Sometimes I lose sleep just thinking aspirational thoughts. Any advice on how to shut off the ruminating?
Yeah, that is really hard. I mean, sometimes I lose sleep composing emails that I'm going to send the next day in my mind. It is really difficult. And I think it's about getting to know yourself a little bit better, understand what helps you relax, particularly before you're going to go to sleep. For me, it's writing things down as well. So if there's something that I'm kind of keeping bubbling just below the surface in my mind so that I don't forget it, I write it down, then I don't have to keep it in my mind anymore. I'm a big user of lists and list apps as well. In terms of learning how to meditate, I think that's a really hard thing to do on your own. So, for example, I've done a mindfulness course in the past, and pretty much the whole time thought that I was doing it badly or not getting the hang of it, as this person has said. So I think doing it as part of a group and realizing that there's a kind of joint frustration in trying to quieten your own mind is really helpful, but also learning from people who've been doing it for years and hearing that they also still struggle at times.
Absolutely. Excellent. So perhaps sort of group meditation or mindfulness as well.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds awful, doesn't it? But actually,
it sounds very sensible. I think, because you've got that sort of team spirit to experience it together and learn. Corrine, anything to add?
Yeah, I think. Thank you for the person who asked this. You're not alone. I think many of us have busy minds, and it's like learning a new skill. It takes a long time to learn to quieten the busy mind. One of the ways I haven't perfected it. Some days it works and some days it doesn't. Some days, we're blessed with a busy mind because our brains have the capacity to think and work things out. But one of the things I do love outdoors, so I will often go outside. Tina's mentioned going for walks and having walking meetings. But one way I quieten my mind is to go out. And it's a form of mindfulness, but it's just using my senses to notice what's around me. And I think, when I'm walking in a wood, I would just notice what I can see initially and then what I can hear. And it's amazing once you start really tuning into your hearing and becoming curious about what you're hearing, it blocks other things out and you can hear far more than you think you can hear. And then moving around to maybe what you can feel. And we all have preferences, but I think it's just that focusing. But also don't get frustrated if it doesn't work on one day, because I can go out one day going, right, I'm going to notice what I see. My brain's going, yeah, but you haven't cooked dinner yet, or you've got this to do, you've got that to do. And if it doesn't want to quieten, it doesn't want to quieten. But it's give it that opportunity.
Absolutely. Give it that opportunity, and I mean the sort of really listening is an interesting one, isn't it? Because there's so much that we can hear that we just tune out of. I suspect, those little sounds like the the thermostat on the heater or whatever clicking on and off, or the sound of the air conditioning.
Yeah, I mean, I just would just like to add, because I've been doing it today. So I was out today in Southampton in a country park that was actually very close to Southampton Airport. So the initial thing was I could hear the planes. When I actually stopped to listen more, I could hear the birds. I could hear a blackbird, I could hear a robin. That's about the end of my bird recognition. The other birds, but I didn't hear those initially. I just heard the human noise, the human noise.
Yeah.
And one thing I probably would just add, Adrian, is a lot of mindfulness practices often advocate thinking about your breathing and linking your breathing to kind of calming your mind. If you focus on your breathing, it's a lot harder to keep all of those ruminating thoughts and different thoughts that popping in and out of your head if you are truly concentrating on your breaths in and out.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a couple of things from a personal perspective to add as well, which I've personally found helpful, is changing the lighting. Particularly like properly unwinding of an evening, if you're looking to quiet the mind before bed, for example, is and avoiding white light from things like phone and electronic devices, I think can be quite important as well, from what I gather. So, okay, so we've got time for just another couple of questions. So we'll try and keep these fairly brief and punchy, although they are big questions, so it's going to be tricky. But there are actually quite a lot of questions asked about Agile techniques. And of course, we're not here to in this session to talk specifically about Agile or Scrum or whatever. But if we sort of bundle some of them together and ask the question, you know, are the sort of well-being challenges, or are the well-being considerations different if we were in, say, a Scrum or an Agile environment versus a more traditional waterfall environment? So, Corrine, what would your view on that be?
Oh gosh, I suppose in a nutshell, I don't think they are different. I suppose with Agile, in an Agile environment, I suppose you look at what the thinking behind Agile is very much about collaboration and working together. So I would come back to some of the things Tina talked about having the charters, having as many open and honest conversations as possible. But I think the other thing for me to think about, which I suppose maybe, you know, if we were true Agile and everybody's together all the time, working together and collaborating, is recognizing that people do need breaks, regular breaks, because our focus period's quite short, each of us. And actually, and I'm talking about myself here, and I can't generalize across the whole profession, but a lot of business analysts tend to be thinkers, tend to be slightly more introverted than extroverted. So you do need time alone to recharge.
Yeah.
And it may be only 5 or 10 minutes. Whereas sometimes in a more waterfall environment where things are structured, you may be working alone. You may not be. But I just feel with Agile, whether you're lots of people all the time, lots of meetings, lots of stand-up meetings, lots of scrums, lots of talking to each other, building in that time for reflection. You know, it might just be a 10-minute coffee break or go outside for a quick walk. But that's the first thing that comes to mind for me to do with Agile.
That really resonates with me, Corrine. I think the sort of downtime is as important as the uptime, the recharge time, as you put it. So important.
Yeah, and I think my final thing would be, actually, I've unlocked some of the best problems that I've been coming back to the previous question around mindfulness. You know, those ones that stop us being mindful, the kind of chatter, what's this? It's on my mind, but just kind of stepping back occasionally allows the brain to unlock some of these things. So I use it as a bit of I need a break, because I'll come up with the answer if I have 10 minutes out for a coffee.
Yeah.
I think some of the organisations that do a really good job of employing Agile techniques actually have well-being as kind of some of their drivers why they moved to that way of working. So using a Kanban board, for example, one of the main drivers behind using that is to limit the amount of work in progress, which is about kind of being realistic and not having over too much expectation or placing too much pressure on any part of the team. And equally, the use of sprints, being realistic with planning, avoiding burnout. These types of things can usually be built into Agile ways of working. And in good organisations, I think they are very much part of the Agile approach.
That's an interesting aspect as well, because you do hear about some of the higher tech companies. I know it's a bit of a Silicon Valley cliche, but having sleep pods, for example, or or even just proper break rooms. So maybe there's something about that in the design of the workspace as well.
Can I just add another point, Age?
Yeah, please.
I think
please
actually sometimes, and it does come back to Tina's point about walking meetings. Actually, Agile sometimes the standing meetings and moving around often helps us stay more motivated, helps us stay well. So, and also I think a standing meeting tends to be a shorter meeting. And the underlying conversation thing that Agile is very wants to push is more about the conversation. All the sort of factors for Agile do encourage more of a well-being attitude if it's done correctly.
Yeah.
So it can potentially cultivate those conditions. The practices will cultivate the conditions. So.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, fantastic. Well, we haven't answered all of the questions, unfortunately. So if we weren't able to answer your question, I do apologise for that. Corrine and Tina's email address were at the front. We'll see if they're prepared to answer any additional questions in a second. But before we sort of close, I was just keen to get a final quick soundbite or closing thought from both of you. So. I mean, Tina, if you were to conclude or to have one really important thing that you think people should take away from this evening, what would that thing be?
So, well, I know you've heard me say this before, Adrian, but for me, I don't really like the phrase work-life balance, because realistically, there's just your life and how you live it.
Yeah.
And trying to balance that with work on the other side of the scale, I don't think really works for most people. So I just think about your well-being in your life overall, and how your well-being at work is contributing to your overall well-being.
Absolutely, a more holistic approach, which is BAs we ought to be used to, really.
Absolutely.
Ironically. Fantastic. Thanks, Tina. And Corrine? Corrine? Have we lost Corrine?
So yes, I've got my mute button on.
Easily done.
And I was saying, I think my thought's similar. I think it does start with knowing yourself and just kind of checking in, because it's very easy to go through life doing and not noticing what's going on in your mind, what's going on in your body. Our bodies are very good at signaling to us if they're not happy. So I think it's know yourself, know when you're in your good place, know when the body's starting to signal that perhaps things aren't so good, and do something about it. And it can be something really small when it's a small thing from your body, but if you leave it, it becomes a chronic condition, and then you're going into a more difficult situation.
Absolutely. And I think one thing I'd add to both of those actually is, I think if you know colleagues well, like if you've got really good rapport with colleagues, I think it can be okay to actually call people out. And I don't mean in a negative way, but I can remember something very helpful that someone once did for me, which was essentially say, you're sending a lot of emails at 11 o'clock at night. Is everything okay? And for me, it become a bit of a pattern. So sometimes actually having empathy and perhaps looking out for each other, looking out for our colleagues as well, to sort of prevent that culture from cultivating. Okay, so we have sadly got to the very, very end of the session. So I will just bring up the very first slide again. And I mean, Tina and Corrine, if people have got additional ad hoc questions about things that you've said, are you happy for them to drop you a line?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Yeah, and
it's fine with me as well.
And if people want to stay in touch, Tina, are you on LinkedIn? And
I am.
And places like any other way people can stay in touch, or is LinkedIn and email the best?
Is my primary contact. Yeah.
That's your primary social media. And Corrine, I know you're on Twitter as well, and I know we're going to mention your Fresh Air Fridays. Your Fresh Air Fridays initiative in a moment, but any other ways people can stay in touch? Do you have a blog or?
I think LinkedIn's the main way. Yeah, okay. I'm in the middle of setting up a new website around my Fresh Air Fridays work, which is a well-being based company, but I am still working in the field of business analysis. As Adrian said at the beginning, I'm an examiner. I work a lot with business analyst apprentices at the moment, which is really rewarding. But yeah, so I think, I've talked a bit about well-being outside. Tina's mentioned going outside. So if actually well-being in nature is something that is of interest to anybody listening, get in touch with me and I'll have a chat with you about Fresh Air Fridays. Just so you can be aware, it's not about just going outside on a Friday. It's about going outside to feel better and come away with that Friday feeling. And we take, on a Fresh Air Friday session, we take people outside so that you feel good on the inside. I'm running programs for individuals, which is what our community programs are about, but we also have a program where we come into organizations, run a 12-week program, take people outside for 1 hour a week over 12 weeks. It's been really successful with a number of companies, and they're noticing it impacts individuals, but also teams teams are getting a much deeper connection with each other and understanding of each other. So if it's something of interest, get in touch, have a look at the Fresh Air Fridays website. There's not just me, there's some other facilitators around the country.
Fantastic.
I'm not sure we're around the world yet. We have had some interest from overseas and we're always happy to chat. But thank you, Adrian.
No, thank you. Fantastic. What a great initiative. So, well, fantastic. Well, the only final thing to say is a huge thank you both to Corrine and to Tina for taking time out of what I know are, for both of you, very busy schedules to come and be part of this webinar this evening. I mean, I know I've personally got a lot from it. I have no doubt that everyone who is dialed in or who watches the recording will get a great deal from this webinar as well. So please, thank you very much for that. Thank you also to everyone who has dialed in live or is watching the recording. As a reminder, these BA community webinars, really they're designed as an opportunity to discuss topics, ideas that are perhaps not considered core to business analysis, but they're perhaps on the fringe or at the intersection. So to create conversations about new or different ideas. So shortly after this webinar, in the next few hours, you will get an email with a link to a questionnaire, a survey. There's only 3 questions on there. I'd be really, really grateful if you could fill it in. One of the questions on there is, are there any other topics that you would like to hear about? And it would be really valuable if you could type into that any topics you'd like to hear about, because what I'll do is I'll try and find some speakers in the BA community who can speak on those topics. We will be having other webinars, so keep an eye on your email or on the website. The recording will be up in around about 48 hours time, so keep an eye out for that as well. So thank you once again, Corrine and Tina, for being part of the webinar. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Have a fantastic evening or rest of the day, and hope to speak to you all again soon.